The slap echoed through the marble foyer with such force that the pregnant wife's vision went white. But the heartless husband didn't even look up from his phone, where he was texting his mistress about their wedding menu. Charlotte's cheek burned where his mother's hand had connected. But the pain was nothing compared to the 3 months she'd endured working as a maid in what everyone believed was the Bennet family estate. The same estate she had secretly purchased 6 days ago for $47 million cash. Though her husband David remained completely unaware, he was now living in her property while planning to marry another woman. The mistress Diana descended the grand staircase in a wedding dress that cost more than most people's houses. But the cruel irony was suffocating. That staircase had been in Charlotte's family for 4 generations before the Bennets stole everything through a fraudulent bankruptcy scheme that had orphaned her at age 12. And now she owned it all back while they treated her like worthless help. David's mother raised her hand to strike again, shouting about how lazy servants needed to learn their place. Yet the elderly woman had no idea the servant she was assaulting was the secret trillionaire, whose signature on the purchase documents had made every Bennet asset, including the diamonds on her wrinkled fingers, technically Charlotte's property as of last Tuesday. Charlotte had scrubbed the toilet where Diana now admired her reflection, planted the roses for the garden wedding that would celebrate her own replacement. She addressed invitations to the same guests who had attended her marriage to David 3 years ago, when she was still pretending to be poor to test whether anyone would love her for who she was rather than what she had. The pregnancy test had shown positive 7 months ago, but David had immediately claimed the baby couldn't be his, despite their active marriage, using the false accusation of infidelity as justification to move his mistress into their home and force Charlotte into servant quarters, while remaining completely unaware his wife's net worth exceeded his family's entire empire by a factor of 60. Diana called down the stairs for Charlotte to fetch her champagne, and David finally looked up from his phone, not to defend his pregnant wife from his mother's violence, but to remind Charlotte that Diana preferred her champagne in crystal flutes, not regular glasses, as if the choice of glassware was more important than the blood now trickling from Charlotte's split lip. The wedding was planned for Saturday morning at 10 o'clock in the Rose Garden, just 4 days away. And Charlotte had been forced to work as a maid for the woman replacing her since the moment David brought Diana home. But what none of them could see was the eviction notice already printed and sitting in Charlotte's lawyer's briefcase, scheduled for delivery at 10:01 a.m. Saturday, exactly 1 minute after the ceremony would begin. His mother grabbed Charlotte's hair and yanked her head back, hissing that pregnant or not, she would work until the wedding was over and then be thrown into the street with nothing. But the word nothing was laughable. Charlotte's investment portfolio had generated $340,000 in passive income during the 3 seconds this assault had lasted. Even more than the Bennets spent on their mortgage payment each month on a house they no longer own. The backstory was darker than simple betrayal. David had married Charlotte specifically because his mother had identified her as the Montgomery heir, planning to access a trust fund they believed she'd inherited. And when they discovered the Montgomery fortune was locked in complex legal proceedings they couldn't penetrate, David's mother had ordered him to find a replacement with more accessible wealth. Hence Diana, whose banking family's money was liquid and available. What the Bennets never learned was that Charlotte had won those legal proceedings 16 months ago, inheriting not just her family's original fortune, but control of the venture capital fund her grandfather had built. And she'd spent every day since buying up every piece of Bennet debt, every mortgage, every business loan, every country club membership, every single thing that gave them the illusion of power. Charlotte caught her reflection in the antique mirror, the same mirror where she'd posed for photographs as a child before the Bennets destroyed her family. And she saw not the broken maid they believed her to be, but the woman who had methodically dismantled their entire empire while scrubbing their floors and folding their laundry. Diana's voice carried from upstairs, demanding to know why her champagne was taking so long, and David checked his watch with visible annoyance at his wife's incompetence, while his mother released Charlotte's hair with a shove that sent her stumbling forward. It made her pregnant belly hitting the edge of the marble console table hard enough to make her gasp. The baby kicked, a strong, angry movement that reminded Charlotte exactly why she'd endured this humiliation, rather than simply destroying the Bennets from a distance. She wanted them to know, wanted to see their faces when they realized the pregnant wife they'd treated like garbage owned everything they'd spent 3 generations building, wanted them to feel the same helpless devastation her 12-year-old self had felt when their legal manipulations had left her orphaned and penniless on these very steps 20 years ago. Saturday morning would bring more than a wedding. It would bring complete annihilation, the kind of total devastation that erases family legacies and turns wealthy socialites into cautionary tales. And Charlotte was counting down every second until she could watch them crush beneath the weight of their own cruelty. Who was the secret trillionaire before she became the Maid? And what company had her grandfather built that generated billions in venture capital? What specific fraud had the Bennet family committed 20 years ago to steal the Montgomery estate? And why had they chosen to target a 12-year-old orphan? What will happen when Saturday morning arrives and Charlotte reveals her ownership at the exact moment David says "I do" to another woman? And what complete devastation awaits the heartless husband, his mistress, and his mother when they discover every assumption they'd made about power was catastrophically wrong? Charlotte's hands trembled as she poured the champagne into the crystal flute, but the trembling wasn't from fear. It was from the effort required to suppress the smile that threatened to break across her face every time she remembered what Saturday would bring. Diana snatched the glass without acknowledgement, too absorbed in her phone where she was posting photos of the wedding dress with captions about finally finding true love, and the irony was so thick Charlotte could taste it. Diana had been sleeping with David for 3 years, since before Charlotte's pregnancy, yet the mistress genuinely believed she'd won some romantic victory rather than simply being the more financially convenient option his mother had selected. David sat in his father's old leather chair, the chair that now technically belonged to Charlotte, along with every other piece of furniture in the mansion, reviewing expense reports from the family's investment firm. Completely unaware that the firm itself was operating on capital, Charlotte now controlled through a web of shell companies his accountants would need months to untangle if they ever bothered to look. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air, and Charlotte remembered standing in this exact spot 20 years ago as a 12-year-old girl, watching movers carry away her family's belongings, while David's mother directed the operation with the same imperious tone she now used to order Charlotte to scrub floors. And the memory was crystal clear. Charlotte's parents had died in a car accident on a Tuesday, and by Friday afternoon the Bennets had produced documents showing the Montgomery estate was collateral for loans Charlotte's father had supposedly taken. Loans that Charlotte's current forensic accountants had proven were entirely fabricated, but had seemed devastatingly real to a traumatized child with no other family to protect her. David's mother, Eleanor, swept into the room, wearing a Chanel suit that cost more than Charlotte's monthly allowance as a maid. But what Eleanor didn't know was that Charlotte's offshore accounts had accumulated $84 million in the past fiscal quarter alone. Passive returns from investments in 17 different sectors that Eleanor's simple mind couldn't begin to comprehend. Eleanor's eyes narrowed at Charlotte with visible disgust, and she snapped her fingers twice, the same gesture someone might use for a dog, commanding Charlotte to refill Diana's glass, even though it was still 3/4 full. A petty exercise of power that would have broken a weaker woman, but only strengthened Charlotte's resolve. The wedding planning had consumed the household for months, and Charlotte had been forced to participate in every degrading detail. She'd called florists while Diana criticized her phone voice, assembled guest gift bags while David's mother commented on how her pregnant body was letting itself go, carried heavy boxes of decorations up and down stairs, while Diana complained the pregnancy was making Charlotte slow and useless. The nursery that should have been prepared for Charlotte's baby had instead been converted into a gift-wrapping station for wedding presents, and Diana had laughed, actually laughed, while suggesting Charlotte could sleep in the room after the birth, since it's already set up for a baby anyway. David had said nothing during that exchange, just scrolled through his phone with the same blank expression he wore whenever his mother or mistress tormented his pregnant wife. And Charlotte realized he wasn't even pretending to care anymore, because he assumed she had nowhere to go and no power to resist. The Bennet family fortune, built over 3 generations through real estate development and strategic investments, they had been impressive by conventional standards, worth approximately $180 million at its peak. But Charlotte's grandfather's venture capital fund, which she now controlled, had assets exceeding $11 billion, a difference so vast that the Bennets might as well have been playing with monopoly money. Charlotte's mind drifted to a flashback from 15 months ago, the day her lawyer had called with news that the final legal barrier had fallen and the Montgomery inheritance was officially hers. She'd been scrubbing Diana's bathroom at the time, and she'd had to excuse herself to vomit from the overwhelming emotion of knowing she finally had the power to make everything right, though she'd told them it was morning sickness. Eleanor approached Charlotte with visible irritation. Ma grabbed the champagne bottle from her hands with enough force to slosh liquid onto Charlotte's uniform, and hissed that she was moving too slowly, and wedding guests would arrive in 3 days expecting perfection. Not the incompetent service of a pregnant fool who couldn't even pour drinks properly. Charlotte apologized, the words tasting like ash in her mouth but necessary for the performance, and Eleanor's face twisted with satisfaction at the apology. The older woman feeding on Charlotte's apparent submission like a vampire feeds on blood, completely unaware that the submission was theater, and the blood she thought she was draining was actually poison that would destroy her. David stood up from his chair, finally acknowledging Charlotte's presence, but only to remind her that she needed to press his tuxedo for the final fitting tomorrow, and that if she damaged it, there would be consequences, the vague threat hanging in the air like smoke. Meaningless because what consequences could he impose on someone who literally owned the building where he slept? Diana set down her champagne and announced she needed Charlotte to help her try on jewelry options for the wedding, and as Charlotte followed the mistress upstairs, past family portraits that would soon be Charlotte's property along with their frames, she calculated that in exactly 72 hours, the heartless husband and his entire family would learn what real consequences felt like. The jewelry box contained pieces that made Charlotte's breath catch in her throat, but not because of their monetary value. She owned jewelry worth 10 times what Diana was carelessly spreading across the velvet-lined table, but because she recognized every single piece from her childhood. The sapphire necklace had belonged to Charlotte's grandmother, a woman who'd worn it to the opera and let young Charlotte try it on while telling stories about true love and family legacy. And now Diana held it up to her throat while asking David's opinion, as if the stolen heirloom was just another wedding accessory purchased at a boutique. David nodded his approval without really looking, his attention divided between his mistress and his phone, where he was coordinating with the caterer. And Charlotte realized he had no idea these pieces weren't Bennet family jewels at all, but Montgomery treasures that Eleanor had acquired during the fraudulent bankruptcy proceedings 20 years ago. The diamond bracelet had been Charlotte's mother's, worn on her wedding day and in every anniversary photo until the car accident that had orphaned Charlotte and set the Bennett scheme in motion, and Diana slipped it onto her wrist while complaining it was a bit old-fashioned, but would work well enough for the rehearsal dinner. Charlotte's hands clenched into fists behind her back, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave crescent marks, but she maintained the blank expression of a servant who had no personal connection to the items being casually discussed and dismissed. Eleanor entered the room carrying a leather portfolio filled with seating charts for the wedding reception, and she began dictating changes to Charlotte as if she was a secretary rather than David's pregnant wife. Move the Hendersons to table 7, put the Washingtons closer to the family table. Ensure Charlotte's own parents' former friends were seated in the back corner, where they'd be less likely to cause awkwardness by mentioning the previous Mrs. Bennet. The cruelty was so casual it took Charlotte's breath away. Eleanor had deliberately invited people who'd known Charlotte's family specifically to humiliate her, forcing her to serve champagne to the same society, women who'd attended her mother's funeral, and promised to watch over poor little Charlotte. David's phone rang, and he stepped out to take the call, leaving Charlotte alone with Diana and Eleanor, and the two women immediately began discussing her as if she wasn't standing 3 feet away. Diana wondered aloud whether Charlotte would make a scene at the wedding, and Eleanor laughed, a brittle sound like breaking glass, assuring the mistress that Charlotte had been thoroughly broken during her 3 months as a maid and wouldn't dare cause trouble for fear of being thrown out with nothing. The conversation shifted to Charlotte's pregnancy, and Diana's voice dripped with false sympathy as she suggested it was probably for the best that David wasn't the father because imagine if she'd tried to trap him with a baby, completely ignoring the fact that Charlotte and David had been married for 3 years when she got pregnant. Eleanor agreed enthusiastically, adding that she'd always known Charlotte was that type of girl who would use pregnancy to secure her position, and the irony was suffocating. Eleanor had literally engineered Charlotte's marriage to David specifically to access what she believed was the Montgomery fortune, making her the actual gold digger in this scenario. But projection was easier than self-awareness. Charlotte's mind flashed back to the day she'd met David, a memory she'd replayed thousands of times to remind herself why this revenge was necessary. She'd been working as a waitress at an upscale restaurant, deliberately hiding her identity and inheritance to test whether anyone in her former social circle would value her for herself rather than her family name. David had been charming that night, attentive and seemingly genuine, now asking about her dreams and aspirations, and she'd actually believed she'd found someone who saw past wealth and status to the person underneath. But that illusion had shattered exactly 2 weeks after their wedding when she'd overheard David and Eleanor discussing the Montgomery Trust and how much longer until they could access the principal. The conversation she'd overheard had revealed everything. Eleanor had recognized Charlotte despite her assumed name and working-class job, had investigated her background thoroughly, and had literally instructed David to court her, marry her, and extract her inheritance before discarding her. Charlotte had nearly confronted them that night, but something had stopped her. An instinct that told her the revenge would be sweeter if she let them think they'd succeeded. If she let them believe she was as powerless and stupid as they assumed. Diana held up the sapphire necklace again, this time asking Charlotte directly whether she thought it matched the wedding dress, and Charlotte forced herself to respond with the deference of a servant, saying it looked beautiful while her mind screamed that the necklace had been her grandmother's most precious possession. Eleanor checked her watch and announced she had a hair appointment, reminding Charlotte to have the guest bathroom scrubbed before the evening, because David's cousins were arriving from Boston, and we can't have them thinking we're the type of family who tolerates dirt. The older woman paused at the door, turning back to deliver one final cruelty. She told Charlotte that after the wedding, after she'd been officially replaced and divorced, Aunt Eleanor would write her a reference letter for domestic work since you've actually become quite good at cleaning, and it's not like you're qualified for anything else. Charlotte nodded, thanked Eleanor for her kindness, and watched the heartless woman leave with a satisfied smile, completely unaware that the reference letter would be irrelevant because by Sunday afternoon, Eleanor herself would be unemployable, her family name synonymous with fraud, and her social standing demolished. Diana returned to admiring herself in the full-length mirror, the mirror that had reflected 4 generations of Montgomery women and now showed a thief wearing stolen jewels, and Charlotte excused herself to prepare dinner while Diana waved her away without looking up. The kitchen had been Charlotte's refuge during these 3 months of degradation, and the one place where she could be alone with her thoughts and her plans. And as she began chopping vegetables for a meal, she wouldn't be allowed to eat with the family. Her phone buzzed with a text from her attorney. All documents finalized. Eviction notice ready for Saturday, 10:01 a.m. Press release drafted for 10:05 a.m. Are you certain you want to proceed? Charlotte's response was immediate and unambiguous. Absolutely certain. They deserve everything that's coming. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable cold, and Charlotte woke in the servants' quarters, a converted storage room with a single window that overlooked the rose garden where tomorrow's wedding would take place, to the sound of Diana's laughter echoing through the mansion. The mistress was on the phone with her bridesmaids, describing in gleeful detail how she'd won David away from his frumpy, poor excuse for a wife, and each word carried clearly through the thin walls that separated Charlotte's room from the main house. An architectural reminder that even the building itself had been designed to keep servants separate from family. Charlotte's back ached from the inadequate mattress, and her swollen feet throbbed from yesterday's 14-hour shift of wedding preparations. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional burden of maintaining this charade for one more day, when every instinct screamed at her to reveal the truth immediately and watch their faces crumble. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Charlotte whispered to her unborn daughter that tomorrow would change everything. that she'd never grow up wondering if she was worthy or valuable, that she'd know from her first breath that her mother had dismantled an empire to prove that cruelty always has consequences. David's voice joined Diana's laughter, and Charlotte heard him say something about finally having the right woman by my side, a statement so devastating in its casual dismissal of their 3-year marriage that Charlotte had to grip the edge of her bed to steady herself. A flashback crashed over her. Their wedding day 3 years ago, when David had whispered promises about partnership and forever while his mother watched from the front row with calculating eyes, and Charlotte, still naive enough to believe in love despite her traumatic childhood, had thought she'd finally found a family to replace the one the Bennets had stolen from her. The irony of that memory was almost unbearable now. She'd married into the very family that had destroyed hers, like a lamb voluntarily entering the wolf's den, and only the universe's sense of poetic justice had given her the tools to turn the tables so completely. Eleanor's sharp voice cut through Charlotte's thoughts, summoning her to the kitchen immediately, and when Charlotte took a moment to compose herself before emerging from the servants' quarters to face whatever new humiliation awaited. The kitchen was chaos. Caterers were arriving early to prep for tomorrow's reception. Florists were assembling centerpieces on every available surface, and Eleanor stood in the center of it all like a general commanding troops, her face flushed with the excitement of orchestrating what she believed would be her family's social triumph. Eleanor's eyes landed on Charlotte with immediate disdain, and she announced in front of all the vendors that Charlotte would be serving at the wedding reception tomorrow since she's become so good at serving, and we might as well get some use out of her before she leaves. The caterers exchanged uncomfortable glances, Wooded clearly recognizing the cruelty but saying nothing because the Bennets were paying their invoices, and Charlotte felt the familiar burn of humiliation mixed with the cold satisfaction of knowing these same vendors would be gossiping about the Bennets' spectacular downfall by Sunday evening. Diana entered the kitchen wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than the caterers earned in a month, and she immediately began critiquing the food presentation, sending back plate after plate with increasingly petty complaints while Charlotte was ordered to carry the rejected dishes back to the kitchen staff. David appeared in the doorway, and for one brief moment, Charlotte saw something flicker across his face. Was it guilt? Regret? A recognition of how far he'd fallen from the charming man who'd courted her? But the moment passed, and his expression hardened back into the cold indifference that had characterized their interactions for the past 7 months. Eleanor directed Charlotte to begin setting up chairs in the rose garden for tomorrow's ceremony, and despite Charlotte's visible pregnancy and the heavy lifting involved, neither David nor Diana nor Eleanor offered to help or hire additional staff, because in their minds Charlotte wasn't a pregnant woman who deserved consideration, but a servant whose comfort was irrelevant. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Charlotte carried folding chairs from the storage shed to the garden, and she found herself thinking about her grandfather, the man whose venture capital fund she now controlled and who'd built his fortune on the principle that you could judge people's character by how they treated those who could do nothing for them. He would have been disgusted by the Bennets, but Charlotte thought he might have approved of her strategy. Letting them reveal their true nature completely before destroying them ensured there would be no sympathy, no second chances, no redemption arc where they could claim they'd learned and grown. Diana called out from the balcony that the chairs weren't aligned properly, and Charlotte had to bite her tongue to prevent herself from shouting back that tomorrow Diana would have no balcony to stand on because the entire property would be officially Charlotte's, and the eviction notice would give them exactly 2 hours to remove their personal belongings before security arrived. Eleanor emerged from the house carrying a clipboard, and she began inspecting Charlotte's work with the kind of meticulous cruelty that suggested she actively enjoyed finding fault, criticizing the spacing between chairs, the angle of the rows, the placement of the aisle runner that Charlotte had spent an hour positioning perfectly. The older woman's face was flushed with petty triumph, and she announced that Charlotte would need to redo everything after lunch. But first she needed to help Diana with her final dress fitting, because the bride's comfort comes before a servant's convenience. Charlotte followed Eleanor back into the house, her body exhausted but her mind sharp and focused on the countdown. 24 hours until the wedding, 24 hours and 1 minute until the eviction notice, 24 hours and 5 minutes until the press release that would inform every major news outlet that the Bennet family's entire empire had been systematically acquired by the poor orphan they defrauded 20 years ago. The dress fitting took place in Charlotte's former master bedroom, a space she'd been banned from entering for 3 months and seeing her clothes still hanging in the closet. David hadn't even bothered to remove them. Anash just shoved them to one side to make room for Diana's wardrobe, triggered something primal in Charlotte's chest. Diana stood on a small platform while the seamstress made final adjustments to the wedding gown, and Eleanor circled her like a proud mother, occasionally glancing at Charlotte with undisguised contempt, as if to emphasize the contrast between the worthy bride and the unworthy wife being replaced. The seamstress asked Charlotte to hold a pincushion, essentially using her as a furniture piece rather than a person, and Charlotte complied while mentally reviewing the legal documents that would transfer not just the estate, but 17 subsidiary properties, 8 investment accounts, and controlling interest in the Bennet family's primary business into her name. And Diana turned to admire herself in the three-way mirror, the same mirror where Charlotte had gotten ready on her own wedding day. And the mistress sighed with satisfaction, saying this was what a real wedding looks like, not whatever courthouse situation David had with her, deliberately mischaracterizing Charlotte and David's elaborate ceremony to rewrite history into something more flattering. Eleanor laughed and agreed, adding that she'd always regretted allowing David to marry Charlotte in the first place, as if Charlotte's 3 years of service to this family, her pregnancy, her labor, her humiliation, had all been an unfortunate mistake that was finally being corrected. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Charlotte realized her daughter could probably sense her elevated heart rate. With the rage and anticipation mixing into something that felt almost like joy, because tomorrow wouldn't just be about revenge, it would be about justice, restoration, and teaching her daughter that women who are underestimated can become the most dangerous force in any room. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of perfect weather that romantic movies feature in their final scenes, and Charlotte woke to the sound of the string quartet arriving for setup, their instruments carrying notes of classical music through the mansion that would soon become a soundtrack to total devastation. Diana's bridesmaids had stayed overnight, and their excited chatter filled the hallways as they prepared for the ceremony, completely unaware that in exactly 3 hours their celebration would transform into a spectacle they'd be discussing in therapy sessions for years to come. Charlotte, dressed in the plain black uniform Eleanor had specifically purchased for her to wear while serving at the reception. And the symbolism wasn't lost on her. Eleanor wanted the guests to see David's pregnant wife dressed as a servant while he married his mistress, a final public humiliation that would cement the Bennet family's supposed superiority. David was already dressed in his tuxedo when Charlotte emerged from the servants' quarters, and he actually had the audacity to critique her appearance, saying she looked disheveled and needed to make more effort for his wedding day, as if she should prioritize her appearance as a servant over her dignity as his wife and the mother of his child. The guests began arriving at 9:30, and Charlotte recognized every face: old family friends who'd abandoned her after her parents' death, social climbers who'd courted the Bennets' favor, business associates who'd participated in the network of fraud that had stolen the Montgomery estate. Eleanor had strategically invited Charlotte's parents' former friends and seated them where they'd have a clear view of Charlotte serving drinks. And as Charlotte carried champagne trays past Mrs. Henderson, a woman who'd promised Charlotte's dying mother she'd watch over her daughter, the older woman actually had the grace to look ashamed before accepting her glass. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock in the Rose Garden, and Charlotte watched from the kitchen window as guests took their seats among the flowers she'd planted with her own hands, on chairs she'd arranged and rearranged until Eleanor was satisfied. Diana appeared at the top of the grand staircase, wearing Charlotte's grandmother's sapphire necklace and Charlotte's mother's diamond bracelet, carrying a bouquet of roses that had been cultivated in soil Charlotte's great-grandfather had imported from Italy 90 years ago. About to marry Charlotte's husband in Charlotte's ancestral home, while Charlotte watched in a servant's uniform. David took his position at the altar, and Charlotte could see him from her vantage point in the kitchen, his face carefully composed into an expression of solemn joy that looked rehearsed rather than genuine, and she wondered if he'd ever actually loved her, or if every moment had been performance. The wedding march began at exactly 10 a.m., and Diana started her descent down the staircase while guests rose to their feet, phones out to capture the moment. Erin Charlotte's own phone buzzed with a text from her attorney. "Process server is in position. Confirm execution?" Charlotte's finger hovered over the screen for just a moment, a final chance to show mercy, to take the high road, to let karma work at its own pace. But then she remembered 12-year-old Charlotte sobbing on these same steps while movers stole her family's furniture, and she typed 3 letters. "Yes." Diana reached the garden and began her walk down the aisle, and Charlotte moved to her own position by the kitchen door, where she could see everything that was about to unfold. The officiant began the ceremony with traditional words about love and commitment, and David actually smiled at Diana, as if he'd forgotten he was already married to the woman watching from the servants' entrance. The vows were exchanged, David promising faithfulness to a woman he'd been cheating with for 3 years, Diana promising honesty while wearing stolen jewelry, and the officiant reached the critical moment. "If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." Charlotte said nothing, because her objection wouldn't come in words but in actions, and right on schedule at 10:01 a.m., a man in a suit approached David and Diana at the altar. The process server's voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent garden. "David Bennett, Eleanor Bennett, you're being served with eviction notices, foreclosure proceedings, and notification that this property and all associated assets have been sold to Montgomery Ventures, LLC." The guests gasped collectively. But the server wasn't finished. "You have 2 hours to remove personal belongings before law enforcement arrives to ensure compliance." David's face went from confused to pale to furious in the span of 3 seconds, and he snatched the papers from the server's hands, his eyes scanning the legal language that was probably incomprehensible in his panic. Eleanor pushed through the crowd, her voice shrill with indignation, demanding to know what kind of scam this was, who had the audacity to interrupt her son's wedding. Where was the manager she could speak to, as if reality itself had a complaints department? Diana stood frozen in her wedding dress, the bouquet falling from her hands as she realized the fairy tale was collapsing around her, and several guests had already begun filming, their phones capturing every moment of the Bennett family's public destruction. Charlotte stepped out from the kitchen and walked slowly toward the garden, her pregnant belly leading the way, and every eye turned to her as recognition began to dawn on the more intelligent guests. David saw her approaching and actually laughed, a desperate, disbelieving sound, asking her if she'd hired some actors to ruin his wedding, still unable to conceive that his maid wife could have orchestrated something this sophisticated. Charlotte stopped at the edge of the garden and said clearly, so everyone could hear, "Montgomery Ventures, LLC is my company. I purchased this estate, my family's estate that your mother stole 20 years ago, along with every piece of Bennett property, every investment account, every business asset. You've been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, planning your wedding in my garden. You have 2 hours to leave." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes and tsunamis. And then Eleanor lunged at Charlotte with her hands raised to strike, but this time Charlotte didn't flinch. Security guards, Charlotte's security guards hired weeks ago and positioned around the property, stepped forward to restrain Eleanor, and the older woman's face contorted with rage and disbelief as she screamed about lawyers and lawsuits and how Charlotte couldn't possibly have the money or power to do this. Charlotte pulled out her phone and showed the screen to the crowd, displaying her investment portfolio with its $11 billion balance, and she heard several guests gasp and whisper. With the truth spreading through the crowd like wildfire, David sank to his knees in the grass, the papers falling from his hands, and Charlotte watched him realize that everything he'd assumed about power, about his superiority, about his right to discard and degrade her, had been catastrophically wrong. Diana backed away slowly, her wedding dress dragging through the dirt, and Charlotte almost felt sorry for the mistress until she remembered Diana laughing while Charlotte scrubbed toilets and cleaned up after her. The press had arrived, Charlotte's attorney had sent the release at exactly 10:05 a.m. as planned, and reporters were already pushing through the crowd, cameras flashing, questions flying about the Bennett family fraud and the secret trillionaire's revenge. Charlotte turned to address the guests. many of whom had known her parents and had abandoned her when she needed them most. 20 years ago, the Bennets orchestrated a fraudulent bankruptcy to steal my family's estate after my parents died. I was 12 years old, orphaned and alone, and every person in this garden either participated or looked away. I married David because I wanted to believe someone could love me for who I was, but his mother had recognized me and planned the entire courtship to access my inheritance. When that didn't work, he replaced me with someone whose money was more accessible. For 3 months, I've served as a maid in my own home while pregnant with his child, and I've watched all of you treat me like I was worthless. Now you know the truth. I own everything. The wedding is over. The reception is canceled. The Bennett empire is dismantled. And every single one of you will remember this day as the moment you learn that cruelty has consequences. Eleanor collapsed in the grass, her social standing destroyed in under 5 minutes, and several guests were already leaving, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. David looked up at Charlotte with something that might have been remorse or might have been self-pity, but she couldn't tell and didn't care, because the heartless husband who'd planned his wedding while she worked as a maid for his mistress was finally experiencing the devastation he'd earned. Charlotte's phone rang, her attorney confirming that the story had been picked up by every major news outlet, and the Bennett family's social media was already exploding with condemnation. And she smiled, feeling her daughter kick as if in approval. The guests scattered like roaches when lights turned on, and within 20 minutes the garden was empty except for David, Diana, Eleanor, and the discarded wedding decorations that would never be used. Charlotte stood in the center of her reclaimed estate, the secret trillionaire no longer secret, the maid revealed as the master, the pregnant wife transformed into the architect of total devastation, and she whispered to her unborn daughter, "This is how we teach the world that underestimating women is the most expensive mistake anyone can make." The Bennets had 2 hours to pack their belongings and leave forever, crushed and devastated by the woman they'd treated as worthless, and Charlotte knew they'd spend the rest of their lives wondering how they'd missed the signs, how the maid had been the millionaire, and how their cruelty had authored their complete destruction. What this story taught, this story demonstrated that true power doesn't need to announce itself. It positions itself strategically and strikes at the perfect moment. People's treatment of those they perceive as powerless reveals their authentic character. Revenge executed with patience and precision is infinitely more devastating than emotional retaliation. Underestimating someone based on their current circumstances is a catastrophic error in judgment. Justice delayed can be justice amplified when the delay is strategic rather than passive. The most powerful victories come when the oppressed reclaim not just their dignity, but everything their oppressors built on stolen ground. Moral lessons. Never judge someone's worth by their current situation. Circumstances change, but character reveals itself. Cruelty toward the vulnerable. One often comes from people who are fundamentally weak. Those who mistake kindness for weakness eventually pay the heaviest price. One, strategic patience is more powerful than immediate confrontation. How you treat people when you have power over them defines who you truly are. The nursery in the east wing of the Montgomery estate, Charlotte had immediately restored its original name, was painted in soft lavender with cream accents, and morning sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked the rose garden where a wedding had ended and a reckoning had begun. Charlotte sat in the antique rocking chair that had belonged to her grandmother, cradling 3-week-old Grace Elizabeth Montgomery in her arms, and the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around Charlotte's thumb with a grip that felt like a promise to hold on to everything they'd reclaimed together. The estate had been transformed in the 90 days since the Bennets' spectacular downfall, but not through renovation or redesign. Charlotte had simply restored it to its original glory. By removing the gaudy additions Eleanor had made and uncovering the authentic beauty her family had cultivated over 4 generations. The media frenzy had been intense for the first month, with reporters camping outside the gates and every news outlet running variations of the same headline. Secret billionaire's revenge. Pregnant maid reveals she owned everything. But Charlotte had given exactly one interview to a carefully selected journalist who understood the story wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, restoration, and teaching her daughter that women who are underestimated can change the entire game. The fallout for the Bennett family had been swift and absolute, more devastating than Charlotte had even anticipated, though she felt no guilt about their destruction because they'd authored every page of their own downfall. And David had tried to contest the property transfers, but Charlotte's legal team had buried him in documentation. Every fraudulent loan from 20 years ago, every forged signature, every illegal transfer that had stolen the Montgomery estate. The evidence was so overwhelming that David's own attorneys had advised him to settle rather than face criminal prosecution, and he'd signed away any claim to Charlotte's property or her daughter in exchange for the prosecutors agreeing not to file charges. The last Charlotte had heard, David was working as a mid-level manager at a software company in Ohio. His MBA from an elite university, doing little to help him rebuild a career after being publicly exposed as the heartless husband who'd forced his pregnant wife to serve as a maid while planning his wedding to another woman. Diana had fared slightly better, but only because her family had money and connections that allowed them to weather scandal. She'd moved to Europe, and Charlotte had seen photos of the former mistress on social media, her comments disabled because the internet had been merciless in its judgment of a woman who'd worn stolen jewelry to marry someone else's husband. Eleanor's destruction had been the most complete, and while Charlotte had expected to feel triumphant about the older woman's fall, she mostly felt a distant pity for someone who'd built her entire identity on cruelty and social status. Eleanor had lost everything: her home, her wealth, her position in society, and most painfully, her reputation. She'd gone from being a respected society matron to a cautionary tale about fraud and arrogance. The woman had tried to join her usual lunch group at the country club 2 weeks after the wedding disaster, and she'd been informed her membership had been reevaluated, a polite way of saying she'd been blacklisted. And when she'd demanded to speak with the club president, she'd discovered that Charlotte now sat on the board and had voted against reinstating her membership. Eleanor had written Charlotte a letter, not an apology, but a rambling justification claiming she'd only done what any mother would do to secure her son's future, completely unable to recognize that destroying a 12-year-old orphan and defrauding her of her inheritance wasn't maternal protection, but criminal cruelty. So Charlotte had kept the letter in a file labeled Evidence of Unrepentance, because it perfectly demonstrated that some people would rather rewrite reality than accept accountability. The Montgomery estate had become something more than just Charlotte's reclaimed home. It had transformed into a sanctuary for women rebuilding their lives after abuse, betrayal, or loss. Charlotte had established the Grace Elizabeth Foundation, named for her daughter and her grandmother, 3 weeks after the wedding disaster, and the foundation provided housing, legal services, job training, and counseling for women escaping situations where they'd been underestimated, undervalued, or utterly destroyed by people who should have protected them. The West Wing of the estate now housed 12 women and their children, and Charlotte had hired staff who understood trauma because they'd survived it themselves. She'd offered the position of house manager to Mrs. Henderson, the woman who'd promised Charlotte's dying mother she'd watch over her daughter, but had failed to intervene when the Bennets stole everything. And Mrs. Henderson had accepted while crying and apologizing for 20 minutes straight, which Charlotte had accepted because she understood that fear and social pressure could make good people complicit in terrible things. The financial revelations had been staggering even to Charlotte herself, because once her forensic accountants had untangled 20 years of Bennett family finances, they discovered that the Bennets hadn't just stolen the Montgomery estate. They'd built their entire empire on a foundation of fraud, using Charlotte's family property as collateral for loans they'd never intended to repay, leveraging the Montgomery name and reputation to secure business deals they couldn't have accessed otherwise. Charlotte had recovered not just her original inheritance, but an additional $47 million in damages from various business associates who'd knowingly participated in the scheme, and every dollar had gone into the foundation that would help other women reclaim their power. The venture capital fund her grandfather had built continued to generate returns that seemed almost absurd. Last quarter alone had produced $127 million in profits, and Charlotte had started directing portions of those returns toward systemic change, funding legal aid organizations, supporting politicians who prioritize women's economic independence, or and investing in companies led by women who'd been told they weren't qualified or capable. Grace stirred in Charlotte's arms, making the small mewing sounds that preceded crying, and Charlotte shifted her to begin nursing, thinking about how this tiny human would grow up knowing her worth was inherent rather than earned, that her mother had dismantled an empire to prove that cruelty has consequences. The nursery walls displayed photographs of 4 generations of Montgomery women, and Charlotte had added her own story to that legacy. The orphan who'd become a maid, who'd revealed herself as a billionaire, who'd destroyed those who'd underestimated her. She'd also included photographs of the women currently living in the estate's West Wing, because they were part of this legacy too. Women who'd been broken but were rebuilding, and women who'd been dismissed but were discovering their power, women who'd been told they were worthless but were learning they were priceless. A knock on the nursery door interrupted her thoughts, and Charlotte called out permission to enter, expecting Mrs. Henderson with the morning tea she'd insisted on providing, despite Charlotte's protests that she didn't need to be served. Instead, a young woman entered, barely 22 years old, with bruises fading on her arms and terror still lingering in her eyes. And Charlotte recognized her as the newest resident of the foundation, a woman named Jennifer, who'd arrived 3 days ago, with nothing but the clothes she was wearing, and a daughter not much older than Grace. Jennifer apologized for interrupting, but said she just received news that the restraining order against her ex-husband had been approved, and she'd wanted to thank Charlotte personally because without the foundation's legal team, she never could have afforded the attorney fees. Charlotte smiled and invited Jennifer to sit, and as the young woman cradled her own daughter while watching Charlotte nurse Grace, she said something that made Charlotte's eyes fill with tears. "I want my daughter to grow up like yours will, knowing that women who seem powerless can actually be the most powerful people in the room." The interview Charlotte had granted had aired 2 weeks ago, and the response had been overwhelming. Her foundation had received donations totaling $23 million from people who'd been moved by her story, but more importantly, she'd received over 10,000 letters from women sharing their own experiences of being underestimated, degraded, or destroyed by people who'd assumed they had no power to fight back. Charlotte had hired a team to respond to every single letter, and many of those women were now connected with resources that would help them reclaim their own power, rebuild their own empires, and teach their own daughters that survival isn't weakness. It's the foundation of every comeback story ever written. The journalist had asked Charlotte if she regretted not revealing her identity sooner, if the 3 months as a maid had been worth the suffering, and Charlotte had answered with complete honesty. "Every moment of humiliation gave me clarity about who I was dealing with. If I'd revealed my power immediately, they might have apologized, adjusted their behavior, and I would have spent years wondering if they'd actually changed or were just better at hiding their cruelty. By waiting, by enduring, I learned exactly who they were at their core, and I made sure the world learned it too." David had tried to contact her once, about 6 weeks after the wedding disaster, sending a letter through his attorney requesting to be involved in Grace's life, claiming he'd made mistakes but wanted to be a father. Charlotte's response had been delivered by her legal team and was exactly 3 sentences long. "You had 9 months to be a father and chose instead to call my child illegitimate and force me to serve your mistress. You had the DNA test available and refused it. You have no parental rights, no visitation privileges, Sarah and no place in our lives." She'd included documentation of every cruel word, every degrading order, every moment he'd chosen his mistress and his mother over his pregnant wife, and David's attorney had apparently advised him that pursuing custody would mean all of that documentation becoming public record in family court, so he'd backed down. Charlotte had established a trust fund for Grace worth $50 million, ensuring her daughter would never experience the financial vulnerability that had made Charlotte's childhood so traumatic, but she'd also included provisions that Grace would need to work, to create, to contribute to society before accessing the principal, because Charlotte knew that money without purpose created the kind of people who destroyed her family. The rose garden where the wedding had imploded had been completely redesigned, and Charlotte had hosted a ceremony there last week. Not a wedding, but a memorial for her parents and grandparents, with Grace wrapped in a blanket that had belonged to Charlotte's grandmother. She'd invited every woman currently staying at the foundation, and they'd stood in a circle while Charlotte spoke about legacy. about how the cruelest people in our lives often teach us the most important lessons, about how power reclaimed is sweeter than power inherited. Mrs. Henderson had placed flowers on the memorial stone, and several of the younger women had cried, and Charlotte had realized that the Montgomery estate had transformed from a symbol of what she'd lost into a symbol of what couldn't be taken from women who refused to stay broken. The garden now featured a bronze plaque with a quote Charlotte had commissioned from her favorite poet. They buried her, not knowing she was a seed. And underneath it listed the names of every woman who'd stayed at the foundation and successfully rebuilt her life, a list that grew longer every month. Grace finished nursing and let out a satisfied sigh, and Charlotte lifted her to her shoulder for burping, looking out the window at the grounds that had been stolen and reclaimed. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the 12-year-old orphan sobbing on the steps, the young woman testing whether anyone would love her for herself, the wife discovering her marriage was a fraud, the maid enduring degradation while planning devastation, the mother revealing her power at the perfect moment, and finally, the woman sitting in her family home with her daughter in her arms and 12 other women rebuilding their lives down the hall. The revenge had been satisfying, undeniably so, but the restoration was sacred. She'd taken back not just property, but dignity, not just wealth, but legacy, not just power, but purpose. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, and Charlotte glanced at it while supporting Grace's head. Bennett family fraud case leads to new legislation. Senator introduces bill to protect orphaned heirs. The article explained that Charlotte's story had prompted lawmakers to close legal loopholes that allowed families like the Bennets to exploit vulnerable children, and if the bill passed, it would require additional oversight for estate proceedings involving minors without living parents. Charlotte had testified before the state legislature 2 weeks ago, Grace sleeping in a carrier against her chest while she described how a 12-year-old girl had been legally robbed because the system assumed adults had her best interests at heart, and apparently her testimony had moved several previously undecided legislators to support the reform. The bill would be called the Montgomery Act, and if it passed, Charlotte's suffering would prevent countless other children from experiencing similar exploitation. Jennifer stood to leave, thanking Charlotte again, and as she reached the door, she turned back with a question that had clearly been weighing on her. Do you ever wish you just destroyed them privately instead of so publicly? Wouldn't it have been easier? Charlotte considered the question carefully while adjusting Grace's blanket, and then she answered with the truth she'd learned over these past 3 months. If I'd destroyed them privately, people would have whispered that I was bitter or vindictive or couldn't let go of the past. By doing it publicly, I made sure everyone knew exactly what they'd done and exactly what happens when you mistake quietness for weakness. The Bennett's downfall is teaching millions of people to think twice before underestimating someone, and that lesson is worth every uncomfortable moment of publicity. Jennifer nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes, and she said, My ex-husband used to say I was too stupid to leave him, that I'd never survive on my own. When he sees that I did survive, that I'm actually thriving, I want him to know it, to have to live with being wrong about me. Charlotte smiled and told her, Then make sure when you do thrive, you do it loudly enough that he can't pretend not to notice. The afternoon brought visitors. Charlotte's attorney arrived with papers to sign for a new property acquisition, a historic building downtown that would become the foundation's second location, providing services for women who couldn't relocate to the estate but needed support in the city. The building had once housed Bennett Financial Services, David's family business, and Charlotte had purchased it for exactly $1 above the bankruptcy auction minimum, a symbolic price that pleased her sense of poetic justice. The attorney also brought news that Eleanor had filed for bankruptcy herself, unable to maintain even a modest lifestyle without the wealth she'd spent decades accumulating through fraud and manipulation. And while Charlotte felt no joy in the older woman's poverty, she felt a deep satisfaction knowing that consequences had finally caught up with someone who'd spent her entire life avoiding them. Grace was 3 weeks old, but Charlotte had already written her a letter to be opened on her 18th birthday, a letter that explained everything: the betrayal, the humiliation, the revelation, the devastation, and most importantly, the lesson that Charlotte hoped Grace would carry into her own life. The letter's final paragraph read, Your father and his family tried to make me believe I was worthless, powerless, and alone. They were wrong about all three things, but I let them believe their lies long enough to document their cruelty and engineer their complete destruction. I tell you this not to teach you revenge, but to teach you patience, strategy, and the understanding that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. You will face people who try to diminish you, who mistake your kindness for weakness or your silence for stupidity. Remember that your great-great-grandfather built an empire. Your great-grandmother preserved it. Your grandmother reclaimed it. And your mother taught the world that women who are buried can grow into forests. You come from women who turned devastation into determination. Never forget that, and never let anyone make you forget it. As the sun set over the Montgomery estate, when Charlotte stood at the nursery window with Grace sleeping against her chest, and she thought about the heartless husband who'd made his pregnant wife work as a maid for his mistress, completely unaware she was the secret trillionaire who just purchased his family's estate. She thought about his mother's slap, the moment that had crystallized her resolve to show no mercy, to deliver devastation so complete that they'd never recover. And she thought about what she'd done, not just crushing them financially, but crushing them socially, reputationally, psychologically, ensuring that for the rest of their lives they'd remember the maid who was actually a billionaire, the wife who was actually the owner, the woman they dismissed who'd actually dismantled everything they'd built across 3 generations. The Bennet family was devastated and would remain devastated forever, their name synonymous with fraud and their legacy erased from the social register they'd valued more than integrity. But Charlotte Montgomery had been restored, rebuilt, and reborn into something more powerful than she'd been before the betrayal. Not just a billionaire, but a mother, a philanthropist, a voice for women who'd been silenced, and a living reminder that the most expensive mistake anyone can make is underestimating a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. Grace stirred and opened her eyes, looking up at Charlotte with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, and Charlotte whispered to her daughter, "You'll grow up knowing that women who seem powerless can shake the foundations of empires. You'll grow up in a house your mother reclaimed from thieves. You'll grow up understanding that justice delayed is sometimes justice perfected. And you'll grow up knowing that your mother loved you enough to endure 3 months of hell to teach the world that cruelty always, always has consequences." The Montgomery estate lights twinkled in the gathering darkness, and in the West Wing, 12 women and their children were sitting down to dinner in a home that represented second chances and new beginnings. Charlotte had transformed her revenge into restoration, her pain into purpose, and her devastation into determination. The heartless husband and his family were crushed and broken, but Charlotte Montgomery was whole, powerful, and teaching the next generation of women that being underestimated is only dangerous if you let them stay comfortable in their assumption. This was her legacy, not the billions in her accounts, but the women rebuilding their lives in her home, the legislation bearing her family's name, and the daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms who would grow up knowing that her mother had faced the worst humanity could offer and had emerged victorious, wealthy, and utterly unbreakable.